I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, North Korea. A dare leader's dead. His 28-year-old son has succeeded him. Will anything change, though, for an economically isolated country? Also, the European Union moves towards a ban on Iranian oil imports, increasing pressure on the controversial nuclear program. And not in the zone, but still in trouble, Hungary is about to start talks with the IMF and the EU over a new loan. So welcome back, everyone, to another year of Counting the Cost, which kind of summed things up in a way. We are still counting the cost of this global economic downturn, the Eurozone crisis too, the issues which just don't go away. But in keeping with our commitment to the world's untold financial stories and news out of the developing economies, we're starting the year in North Korea in light of the death of the so-called dear leader, Kim Jong-il. North Korea is probably the most secretive state in the world. Little is really known about the inner machinations of this regime and how it runs its affairs, or for that matter, the state of the economy. For that, we are reliant on agencies like the United Nations. And to put it into context, we have to look at the North alongside its estranged neighbour, South Korea. Let's start with gross domestic product. If we look at it on a per capita basis, North Korea is producing almost $500 per person, not much. South Korea over $17,000 per person. And then an interesting indicator, this is the number of telephone subscribers per 100 inhabitants. Interesting because you've got only 5.2 in the north and over 100, 154.4 in the south, which shows you how economically advanced they are in the south. And what do the two countries make on a GDP basis? Well, according to IHS Global Insight's estimates, for 2011, North Korea, 29 billion, South Korea, 1.1 trillion. Now, the death of Kim Jong-il has given a lift to the country's defaulted bonds in the vague hope of a Berlin Wall moment, one that could lead possibly to the reunification of the peninsula. What chance really, though, and at what costs? Harry Fawcett investigates for us.
This building houses South Korea's Unification Ministry, the government body that deals with all matters North Korean. As its name suggests, official policy here is that one day the two Koreas will be reunited. If that happens, no matter when it happens, it will be a vastly expensive enterprise. South Korea's per capita GDP stands at more than $20,000 a year. For North Korea, the estimate is closer to $1,000. First, Seoul would have to provide immediate aid, and then long-term rehabilitation of the economy and the infrastructure. Pinning precise numbers to all that is very difficult. It depends on the date, it depends on the circumstances, whether it's an unexpected collapse or a managed transition. But all economists agree that the numbers will be very big.
200 or 300 billion dollars within the next 10 years after the unification. That was the minimum estimation. In terms of the maximum estimation, it went all the way to 2 trillion or 3 trillion dollars for the next 10 years after the unification. So you can see that we have a very wide range of estimations.
That raises the question how to pay for it. In 2010, President Lee Myung-bak put forward his prescription, a unification tax that was to have raised billions of dollars a year. This year, with a fiscal deficit and a general and presidential election, that plan has been shelved. Little wonder, looking at the polls, support even for the necessity of unification, let alone paying for it, has been steadily falling, standing at just 53.7%, according to a recent survey.
I have some reservations about unification. There's a huge debt. Sudden changes would bring huge instability to our country.
We'll have to face the music. It's our problem. Unification is our business.
I won't pay a unification tax. We have nothing to do with the North.
Unification should happen, but if it comes, there will be problems.
The unification tax has for now been replaced by a plan for a unification account, something the government intends to contribute to as and when it can over the next 20 years. The target amount, $50 billion. They're also calling it a unification jar in the hopes of encouraging private donations. On the day that unification finally comes, though, that jar is likely to look pretty small.
We also want to look at Iran this week, and you'll see after this report from Jackie Rowland how we're tying it all together. The news concerning Iran is that the European Union's pushing for a ban on Iranian oil imports. There is a fine balance, though. Such a ban would, in the EU's eyes, dry up the cash flow to Iran's nuclear program. But what about the European countries which need Iranian oil?
The European Union may be moving closer to a ban on oil imports from Iran, but for Turkish officials on a visit to the country, it's business as usual. Turkey relies on Iran for 1/3 of its oil imports, and it does not want to be part of a growing international action against Tehran. If the EU imposes a ban, several European countries will need to look for new suppliers. One option could be Libya, which has just sent its first shipment to Europe since March of last year. But that is small compared to Iran, which produces 3.6 million barrels a day. Iran currently sells 18% of its total oil exports to the EU. That's only about 5% of total EU crude oil imports, but a ban would impact Italy and Greece more directly. Italy bought 13% of its oil from Iran in 2011. And Greece is even more dependent, importing more than 22% of its oil from the country. If an embargo is agreed, there may be a grace period of several months to allow refiners time to find alternative suppliers. Saudi Arabia has already said it's prepared to increase its oil output to make up for any shortfall. But the big question is, how much impact would an EU embargo have on Iran?
Iran has always been ready to counter such hostile actions, and we are not concerned at all about the sanctions. We have taken provisionary measures, and just like we have weathered the storm in the past 32 years, with help from God and efforts that we make, we will be able to survive this as well.
Iran still has buyers in Asia, including China, India, Japan and South Korea, and it will be looking to expand its business in this region.
It may find that quite difficult, particularly in some cases because both Japan and South Korea are themselves at least contemplating the idea of a similar ban to that being talked about by the EU.
The US Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner is due to travel to China and Japan next week. China has cut its imports of Iranian oil for the first 2 months of 2012. But Beijing may be more interested in haggling over prices than putting political pressure on Iran.
Now, to discuss and dissect things like the North-South Korea situation and indeed Iran, we've done something a little different. Earlier in the week, we linked up with 2 guests from the same company, the Eurasia Group, which is a political risk consultancy. In New York was the group's president, and in Washington, D.C., their head of research. Ian Bremmer and David Gordon joining us from the Eurasia Group this week on Counting the Costs, and it's a pleasure to have you both with us. Ian and David, how are you?
Great. Happy New Year to you.
Very well.
Excellent. Let's start off. Actually, what I'm going to do first of all is show our viewers your risk list so we get an idea of the makeup of it. Let's have a look at the first page of risks as we run through them. The end of the 9/11 era, G0 in the Middle East, Eurozone, of course, is up there. The US run after the elections will be a big one. And then we move on to the second page, places like Pakistan, China, Egypt, South Africa, Venezuela. So there's a real mix across the board. I want to focus first of all on North Korea. Ian, let's go to you. It's that big time of uncertainty, of course. We just don't really have enough information, but still you have it high on the risk list.
Well, you know, I would argue, we would argue that North Korea is the single most important geopolitical country risk out there for 2012. Everyone talks about how Iran represents an existential threat for Israel, but frankly, that's because people are much more familiar with the United States. North Korea is a vastly greater existential threat for the South Koreans, and it's really underappreciated. You have a new leader, Kim Jong-un, 28 years old. He's been groomed for less than 2 years for that position. There have been killings and purges among senior leadership, couched as accidental automotive accidents in the last 6 months. They have to effect a very sudden transition in the world's most totalitarian state. There are lots of ways that goes badly. There aren't so many ways it goes well. And the Chinese don't have good information or a heck of a lot of leverage on these guys at the end of the day. So we could either see provocations against the South Koreans in particular as we see a transition, or we could see the country begin to implode. But either way, it's a very significant risk and one that deserves a lot more attention than it's been getting in the headlines.
Okay, so it's a risk to everyone else, but it's kind of a risk to itself as well, isn't it? You talked about imploding. It's got economic problems of its own, of which perhaps we don't even know how deep those economic problems are.
Before the division of the Korean Peninsula, North Korea was really the rich part of the country. Per capita income in South Korea is now at least 10 times that in North Korea. They have food problems. This is a country that is teetering on the edge, and that's one of the things that makes it so dangerous.
David, let's stay with you. If there was to be any change in North Korea, and I know we're talking crystal ball sort of stuff here, but if there was to be any change, what's North Korea got? Has it got anything which it can offer the world? I guess I'm speaking economically.
They do have some resources. China has a number of mining and mineral concessions in the northern part of the country, but they really don't have a lot to offer the rest of the world. This is a classic case of a country that is much more of a negative risk than a positive opportunity.
Okay. Ian, why don't you take this next one on Iran for us, seeing as you did mention it already, and we are looking at a time of increased tension there, and if we look at the economic side of things as well, the oil sanctions, which the EU is looking at as well. How does that tighten up the whole region?
Well, not a surprise we're moving on oil sanctions from Europe, because all three countries that receive oil from Iran have new governments that are less well disposed to Tehran. In Spain, following their elections, and in Greece and Italy, with new technocratic governments more aligned with Brussels and the general European view. Now, the Iranians don't like that, and they've been quite provocative in threatening the United States, saying, don't put that carrier back in the Persian Gulf, or else threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz. But of course, Iran, 60% of Iran's GDP comes from oil export, and so if they were to shut down the Straits, that would be committing economic suicide. It's not going to happen. But having said that, they're really trying to provoke, to try to get some sympathy and get stronger support from the folks that have been better aligned towards them. Most importantly, of course, China, which is going to be picking up any energy that the Europeans aren't buying from the Iranians. This is going to move markets, the possibility for accidental conflict, provocations, because you'll have more military exercises, a lot of folks operating in the area, not communicating very well. That's certainly plausible. But the idea that the Iranians are going to put their finger on the button and say, that's it, game over, that's just not rational. And the Iranian leadership has shown us over the last years that they are actually capable of acting quite rationally with their own national interest at play.
David, they might be, as Ian says, rational and capable of doing that, but equally they need partners in the West who are willing to talk to them and perhaps drop some preconceptions. I
actually don't think that ties are going to improve at all between Iran and the West. I think that right now Iran is really looking towards the East. I think the combination of the assassination, the botched assassination effort against the Saudi ambassador in Washington, and the attack that was orchestrated by the regime on the British embassy in Tehran has totally backfired on Iran. So I don't look at this year as being one in which relations with the West improve. I actually think that the tougher issue with Iran is not the Gulf of Hormuz and oil sanctions. It's the simmering civil war in Syria and where that goes from here, with Iran backing the regime of President Assad and the Western powers, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others increasingly willing to look at alternatives to the Alawite regime in Syria. Syria is Iran's only ally, and this will be a real blow to them.
Gentlemen, two more issues I want to get through with the pair of you. These are number 2 and 3 on your list, and I'm going to start with Ian, actually, because it was a year ago, Ian, I interviewed you probably on this top risks issue again, and you said back then G0. No one will be making any decisions. We've got a G20, but in fact it's going to go to 0. And it kind of happened, really, didn't it? It's been a year of indecision, highlighted by what's gone on in the Eurozone. Do you think that's going to continue?
That's right. And I mean, it's been very clear in the Eurozone in 2011 The United States is the one thing that all of the previous major economic crises had in common: the peso crisis, the ruble crisis, the Asian currency crisis. The one thing they had was that the Secretary of Treasury would come back and would throw some cash and would provide some ground rules. Well, Geithner's been more than willing to get on a plane and go to Europe over the last year, but he's offering advice. He's not writing any checks. And when the French go to the Chinese and say, how about some money, the Chinese response is, well, let's do it multilaterally, which is Chinese for no. So there is no Marshall Plan moment. The Europeans are going to have to muddle through all by themselves. There's not going to be global leadership. Now, in 2012, this really starts to play out in the Middle East. The United States has done with Iraq. The troops are gone. The war is over. But as a consequence, who's going to play a role in helping to ensure security of the country? It's going to be the Iraqis themselves, and they have a center that won't hold very well. Can the Arab League get to the right place in Syria? We're very skeptical about that, and they're moving more towards civil war. So the absence of any international intervention, positive, negative, or otherwise, in the Middle East leaves you to regional powers. And who are they? They're the Saudis, they're the Turks, and they're the Iranians. The Egyptians aren't playing that role right now. They can't. And those three countries do not see eye to eye on many of these issues. That's what's creating so much of the tensions that we're going to be seeing evolving geopolitically over the course of the year.
David, the Eurozone, in 30 seconds, what do you reckon?
Basically, Europe doesn't want to get out in front of this crisis. They want to keep market pressure on the peripheral countries, but there is enough willingness by the European Central Bank to put financing into the system to prevent any kind of a bank failure or a country default. So I think what we see in 2012 is more of what we saw in 2011, of muddling through, but with a lot of negative impact on the markets as they do.
Gentlemen, it's been great talking to you. Ian Bremmer and David Gordon joining us both from the Eurasia Group. You can follow them on Twitter. They're at Eurasia Group as well. Gentlemen, let's do this again, shall we, in about 6 months' time and see if any of this has come true.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much. We enjoyed it.
Happy New Year to you, sir.
All right, we're back to Europe now. No fresh New Year's start there, though plenty of resolutions, I'm sure. Here's the problem for the European Union, and for that matter, the Eurozone. Just how do you manage apparently troublesome members? And we're talking about Hungary here, which could default on its loans. Now, last month, talks with the IMF and the EU broke down. They will resume January 11, but the prospects don't look good. More from Andrew Simmons in Budapest.
Headline news: Hungary's currency is an all-time low against the euro, and the falling confidence in the markets isn't only to do with the economy. This is a popular opposition radio station. It's closing down in March, having lost its broadcast license. Outside the main TV network, there's a hunger strike. Journalists say the centre-right government is exerting more control over the media, and it doesn't end there. A protest movement called Solidarity is gaining ground in opposing a raft of new laws. Here, leaders plan their next moves after a major demonstration against a new constitution they say effectively imposes one-party rule on the country. Since visiting last year, the US Secretary of State has written to Prime Minister Viktor Orban expressing her concerns about media freedom and the independence of the courts. Out of all the issues that could bring things to a head is a threat to the independence of Hungary's central bank. A new law passed in December allows the government to appoint members of a council that sets interest rates. That's in open defiance of the European Union. Now there are doubts on whether the EU and the IMF will deliver on a credit line worth up to $25 billion that this country so desperately needs. Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party swept to power in 2010 with a landslide victory and a two-thirds majority in parliament. He's a former dissident from before the fall of the Soviet bloc in 1989 and says the measures being taken are essential in the transition from communism. But this former dissident, along with 12 others, has signed a protest letter to the EU and Western embassies.
I would say it's an attack against democracy when a party creates a one-party constitution. Even if they have the two-thirds majority, it's I think it's absolutely obligatory to have a consultation with other political parties or even broader. And this did not happen at all.
The government is accusing the protest movement of lying for political gain.
23 years ago, it was communism here, and it was Fidesz and the leadership of this government who was fighting fiercely against communism, and is finishing basically by now the dismantling of a post-communist country. So with the new constitution, we believe we are going to have a full-fledged, if you like, Western type of democracy.
Whatever the size of this government's majority, it's confronted with a disturbing political reality. Restoring confidence in the markets could prove harder than winning a landslide election victory.
So that's the case in Hungary, outside the Eurozone, but we're probably going to see the crisis in the Eurozone limp on in 2012, thus damaging global trade. You know, collectively, the world's biggest economies have a debt payment to make this year of at least $7.6 trillion, according to Bloomberg. The European Central Bank, well, in 2010, it snapped up 212 billion euros worth of government debt. But could be spending, wait for this one, 20 billion euros a week this year on buying up debt from nations like Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Italy. The ECB's also given 489 billion euros in loans to Eurozone banks, which has helped bring down borrowing costs for now. What does all this do for business, though? Because we've really started looking at economics and business as separate beasts, but of course they do affect each other. The international accountancy group Grant Thornton's just put out its latest business report, and we've got its CEO, Ed Nussbaum, joining us from Counting the Costs London studio to talk through that. Ed, thank you for your time. You know, when we look at the Eurozone now, it's been largely economic terms we've spoken in: bonds, debt, bailouts, defaults, all these things. We tend to perhaps forget sometimes about what it's doing to business, the everyday people who keep these economies ticking over. What has your business study shown?
Well, our study is very clear that within the Eurozone, business confidence is down. We survey close to 3,000 business leaders every quarter, and this survey clearly indicates that within the Eurozone, the top business leaders are very concerned about the economy. They're predicting lower growth, lower profitability during 2012.
Because this is what drives it in the end. To go back to my original question, we talk about the bonds and the borrowing rates and the like, but if business isn't doing well, nothing can do well. Employment can't do well, and employment, well, that's probably one of the biggest stories and issues going.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Employment levels are down, particularly within Europe, although you see a lot of variety. Germany has low unemployment. Spain has very high unemployment. But business levels are concerned, business leaders are concerned about the future of their businesses, and it is tied to their concerns about what the politicians are doing and what the banks are doing. The concerns about the collapse of sovereign debt makes all of the business leaders very nervous within the Eurozone.
Can I add to that and ask for your opinion on the way this has all been handled in the Eurozone? We do like to ask our guests on the show how they think the political side of things has been dealt with.
Well, unfortunately, politics gets in the way too often, and what business leaders want and what we want is to see decisive, direct actions that will resolve the Eurozone and the Euro debt crisis once and for all. So, for example, if the European Central Bank would guarantee the sovereign debt of the various member states, that would go a long way to secure the fact that the sovereign debt could be repaid and put the confidence back into business leaders.
All right, go beyond European borders for me, Ed, if you would, and tell us what you think this lack of business confidence in Europe will do to everyone else, because, of course, Europe trades with everyone else.
Well, you're absolutely right. And our survey showed that on a global level, if you look at it for the entire world, business confidence is down. But it varies greatly throughout the world. Certainly, it's way down within the Eurozone, but it's up in China. Business confidence has actually increased in the last quarter in China, and it's increased in Brazil by substantial amounts. And it's up slightly in the U.S. In the United States, business confidence has increased slightly because of increased employment levels, reductions in unemployment levels, a boost to the confidence of the leaders there. So it's a big difference depending on where you are in the world. Confidence levels down in places like Canada and Australia. And it's this domino effect, if you will, coming out of the Eurozone, because for China, the Eurozone is the single largest trade partner for China. And of course, Brazil ships many of their raw materials to China. So it's a domino effect. The Eurozone goes down, it impacts China, it impacts Brazil over the long term.
where would you tell us to look for the good news? Other than, say, Latin America, which you've talked about already. Are there other nice little stories that we haven't heard about?
Well, China and the Asian regions continues to grow. India is relatively flat over the last quarter, but there's still a lot of optimism in India going forward. So even though they're flat with the previous quarter, they continue to be very optimistic about their future. China is extremely optimistic. So there are certain parts of the world that continue to be optimistic, and I think you just have to pick those out.
Yeah, we've got to look for the good news, don't we there, Ed? Ed Nussbaum from Grant Thornton International joining us this week. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
And that's us for this first week of 2012. Great to have you back on board and to get your feedback as well. Here's how to get in touch. You can send a tweet to me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, all one word. If you're not on Twitter, email is just fine. Countingthecost at aljazeera.net is our address. And while you're online, head to aljazeera.com/business. Link onto the CTC page. We're going to pop some web-only content up there this coming week from over the Christmas break. And of course, there is an archive of all our broadcasts to view whenever you'd like. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.